Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Voices from the Mausoleum. Welcome back to another episode of Spooky Sunday Stories. In today's episode, I'm going to be reading a story. I reached out to a friend of mine and asked if it would be okay if I read the second chapter of this book of his that I have. And that book is called The Town Beyond the Trees by Ivan Lopez. He is someone I met, I believe, on Instagram. And I reached out and asked about reading the second chapter from this book. And he also, I'm going to put all of his information as well as where you can find this book in the description for this episode as always. But he also does this series under like a podcast name called Gallivant of the Grotesque. Okay. I almost said from because there's this constant thing about saying voices of the mausoleum instead of voices from the mausoleum. I wonder why those words are so easy to. Anyway, it's Gallivant of the Grotesque. And he does these lore stories on spooky lore stories on Instagram, more recently YouTube and TikTok as well. But again, all that stuff will be in the description for this episode. It's really cool stuff that I've never heard of. Like I watch them when they come up, and it's all of these like spooky legends around like actual stories, and it's a really, really cool series. So if things like that are up your alley, absolutely give him a follow and check out his episodes of that. So without further ado, I'm going to be reading the second chapter from The Town Beyond the Trees by Ivan Lopez. I didn't mark it. Okay, my bad. Okay. 2. The road trip. The shower had turned on, and despite a weak stream coming from it, unsurprising for the caliber of motel Ben had chosen in the name, saving a few bucks, the warm water felt somewhat invigorating on Jessica's skin. After all the driving thus far, nothing could have felt better than that. She was ready to bask in the relaxation for a while. Ben wasn't as excited for the shower. He sat on the disheveled sheets of the queen-size bed, propped up on a stack of pillows behind him so he could sit up as he resorted to channel surfing, a viable means of distraction that definitely beat listening to the showerhead in the bathroom dispense its meager stream with a slight whistle that was sure to turn maddening if Jessica spent enough time in there. Of course, there was nothing stimulating enough to have kept a firm grip on Ben's attention. He was never really the type to spend all his time using his phone as a means of occupation, so naturally he started looking around for anything else to pay attention to, but the amber morning light diffusing through the sheer white curtains didn't mask the small, dull room that hadn't seemed to aesthetically change since the late 80s. Bored, he got up and left the room. After closing the door behind him, the only sound that remained was the steady cascade and whistle of the shower. The near silence was almost serene. Fortunately, there was a gas station in walking distance next door. Granted, Ben had to find a break in the shrubs that separated the parking lots between that and the motel, but it beat having to get back onto the interstate and the next rest stop just to find some caffeine for himself and his fiancée, and the tiny cuts on his legs from the waist-high shrubs were well worth the Java, and leaving Jessica wondering why she was all alone when she stepped out of the shower. Not that she really minded. She knew he would be back and went about her routine. With a large cup of coffee in each hand, Ben made his way back to room 2C, but not without stopping at a bulletin board that caught his attention on the way. The board, hanging on the concrete wall between the window of the tiny lobby and the door of the first room, displayed an array of photos of people of every age, color, and ethnicity. Some overlapped others as there was a little, if any, space left on the board for more. At the top center of the board, in bright red, bold letters, were the words, "Have you seen me?" Ben was left frozen for a moment, entranced. Counting the number of photos seemed nothing short of impossible. That was, unless he was willing to drink his coffee cold. And he absolutely wasn't. And Jessica deserved a hot cup after all the driving she had done thus far. Still, he took a few more seconds to stare at the board, standing completely still in the breezeway and asking himself just how in the hell can so many people turn up missing in an area that seemed to have a human-to-cow ratio that could ensure that every resident in the area would never run out of beef. Surely every person could be easily accounted for. He took a deep sigh and continued to the room. Jessica was sitting on the edge of the bed putting on her shoes when there was a hard knock at the door. She ignored it to put on her other shoe when a few harder raps indicated the growing desire to be let in. She stood up without tying her shoe and opened the door to let Ben inside. She noticed the cups in each of his hands and saw why the knocking was made with his feet. She stood there staring at him in the eyes, and he stared right back. "I thought you left," she said coldly. "I went outside for a second. Saw this hot blonde, almost left forever," Ben replied rapidly and without skipping a beat. Jessica fired back with the same celebrity. "I thought you didn't go for blondes." Yeah, that's why I came back. He lifted the carrier of coffee cup towards her in a gesture of, look, I brought you something. Token of my remorse. The couple had a short stare down, and Jessica slowly shook her head and cracked a playful smirk. Why don't I ever win these? Just accept it and don't ask. Are you going to let me in? Jessica's smirk grew into a more playful smile as she closed the door, leaving her fiancé outside. He just looked at the door and chuckled. A short moment later, the door opened and Jessica let him in, but not before taking a cup. Thanks. Ben walked in and placed the carrier on a small coffee table by the front window. You're welcome. He then sat next to Jessica on the bed. You want to sit for a bit? Let me drive for a while? You don't seem like you slept well last night, Jessica replied casually. You sure you can drive? If you noticed, then that means you were awake too, so it looks like neither of us are really up for it, Ben said, looking at Jessica with a smirk, which was returned immediately. One of us has to do it, and you drove last night. Jessica's smirk turned to a full smile. All right, ready? Yeah. They both stood up, and Jessica knocked back the coffee for a long sip. Ben gave her an impressed and seemingly judgmental stare until she noticed and took the cup away from her face. What? She asked with an embarrassed chuckle. Ben smiled at her. You know that coffee's fresh, right? Jessica gave a quick nod. Mm-hmm. She took another long swig. This time, she leaned her head as far back as she could and finished the coffee, then tossed the cup in a small garbage bin by the door. Ben couldn't look away. However, it wasn't enough to stop the yawn that was big enough to suck all of the air out of the room. She walked over to her suitcase next to the bed, and the couple started to walk out to continue their trek. We really have to stop being so uncomfortable in beds that aren't ours. The interstates in the South were mostly mundane. For miles, the highways were lined with walls of various species of ferns and trees, tall enough to make drivers and their passengers wonder if there's civilization on the other side, and if the foliage barrier is meant to separate them from the commuters and travelers, or to make said travelers feel like they're on another planet. Most of these stretches, however, aren't like the mountainous regions of the Appalachians. This is further south, where mountains are traded in for marshes and cypress trees, and the occasional break from the mundane comes in the form of beautiful rivers and vast swampland, where the tallest trees are spotted on the landscape and are usually a palm or two, claiming a tiny piece of solid ground above the muck. Not the kind of island on which you would want to spend any time, but beautiful nonetheless. It's a shame the scenery doesn't appear often on long drives. Despite the large coffee, Jessica let out a long yawn as she stared at the trees pass from the passenger side. The window was down and the wind in her face did nothing to help wake her. Ben noticed the yawn and instinctively followed suit. Should have paced yourself with that coffee, Ben said as he took a sip of his own and then grimaced. Jessica gave Ben a smart-ass smirk. Maybe, but at least every drop of mine was hot. Ben snickered and placed the cup into his cup holder, then turned on the radio. The set frequency was broadcasting a news story between songs. A mother of 3 was arrested early this morning and charged with stabbing murder of 2 of her children. When her oldest son, only 9 years old, discovered the bodies of his siblings in the bathtub, he immediately called 911. Authorities, Ben quickly turned the volume down after noticing the look of terror on Jessica's face as she stared at the radio, then at him. This state is too screwed up. How'd you survive being born and raised here? Things weren't always this way, Ben answered. Used to be the paradise. Not too sure when things got bizarre. I can't imagine how much more bizarre things can get before all the national news channels and tabloids get bored, Jessica said. Ben slowly shook his head. Change the station. This is disturbing. Jessica changed the station and immediately stumbled upon a synth pop station. Not the kind of stuff that was popular amongst new wave fans in the 80s, but the modern pop that attempted to revive it. She grimaced and moved on, but every station was playing something similar, if not the same thing. She gave Ben a raised eyebrow with the side of her lip to match. He responded with a nod and she turned off the racket. Music's getting bizarre too, Ben said. The sun began to set over the seemingly endless road. Jessica had been asleep for a while, leaving Ben to keep himself awake by his own effort until he noticed her start to wake up. Good, morning, Ben said jokingly, as the sunlight faded and extended some partially eaten beef jerky to Jessica, who happily took it. Breakfast of champions, she said through a voice that stretched with her arms, especially around dinner time, Ben chuckled. We can stop and let me drive. You should sleep. I can take us to the coast. That's a long drive, Jess, Ben said. Are you sure? You've done enough. Pull over. Ben followed her direction and they switched positions. In the middle of the night, as Jessica was driving and snacking on the last bit of beef jerky, she briefly spotted a dark figure on the distance on the side of the road, just on the edge of the tree line. She squinted to try to see into the darkness and get a clearer look at the figure, its body just slightly lighter than the darkness engulfing it, just as the gaslight on the dashboard captured her attention. She let out a short sigh and looked distantly to find a sign for an exit, but looked back at the figure first, which was then nowhere to be found. She raised a confused brow, yawned, and shook her head. It had been too long of a night. She went back to looking for a sign and glanced at her gaslight once more, reminding herself why she was looking about in the first place. Shit, she huffed to herself. After a mile or two of driving with her fists clenched to the wheel, she came up on an exit, come out of the darkness, and into the beams of her car's headlights. There wasn't any signs leading up to the exit, no indication that the road was near. It was odd, but all Jessica cared about was a small blue and white gas pump symbol attached to the larger exit sign, so she veered right and took the exit. That is chapter 2 of The Town Beyond the Trees by Ivan Lopez. Not even lying. There's a lot of cuts in this because every time I read the word yawn, I had to yawn. Damn it. Anyway, every single time I was like, hold it in, hold it in, hold it in. I couldn't read through it. Ugh. Anyway, so like I said, I will put all the Ivan's information in the description for this episode as always, as well as where you can find this book. It's a fun read. I haven't finished it yet, but I am further in it than I was when I did chapter 1 of Jude's diary. So I am further into this than I am that. I think it's only like 100. Let me see. Hold on. Okay, exactly how many. It's not even. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's 102 pages. So thin book, but anyway. So that's all I have for this episode of Spooky Sunday Stories. Thank you guys so much for listening. Have a great rest of your day. Enjoy the week coming up, and I will see you in the next one.